Welcome to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. This is Brother Andre Marie coming to you from St. Benedict Center in Richmond, New Hampshire. Our websites are Catholicism.org and Reconquest.net. My email address is bambam@Catholicism.org. I can also be found easily on Twitter @brother_Andre and on Facebook. Tonight's show is entitled Blessed Karl von Habsburg, Statesman and Victim. My guest in the second segment will be Mr. Charles Coulombe, the founder, or rather the noted Catholic author and historian. And he's going to be here to discuss with us the House of Habsburg and Blessed Emperor Karl and related things. On to the first segment, and I'm going to give a rapid-fire sort of bio of Blessed Karl von Habsburg. Those of you who are familiar with him might be a little bored by this, but it'll be a review for you. Those of you who don't know him, this might whet your appetite to learn more. Blessed Karl von Habsburg was born on August the 17th, 1887, and died at the age of April 1st, 1922. He died at the age, of 34 on April 1st, 1922. When he was born, it was not considered likely that he would reign, or if he would, his rule would be as a much older man, having succeeded two uncles and his father, all of whom were in line after the then reigning Emperor Franz Joseph. But after the suicide of Emperor Franz Joseph's only son, Archduke Rudolf, and then the early death of Blessed Karl's own father, Otto, and then the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914, which, of course, led to World War I, all this changed things and put him right in line to succeed his uncle, Emperor Franz Joseph, both as Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and as King of Hungary. Blessed Karl von Habsburg received an excellent education. At the age of 16, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Imperial Army. He quickly became known as a thoughtful, loyal, and dependable young soldier, an inspiration to his fellow soldiers. He earned promotions and rose up the ranks of the Imperial Army. 5 years before assuming the throne, and oblivious to just how near he was to it, he married the beautiful, vivacious, and devout Princess Zita of the House of Bourbon-Parma. They would eventually have 8 children, 5 born during good times and 3 born when the family were sadly reduced to poverty. Karl proposed to Zita in the Marian shrine of Mariazell before the Blessed Sacrament, and he placed their engagement under the protection of the Blessed Virgin Mary. This is in Austria. Mariazell is a major place of pilgrimage in Austria, which shrine, by the way, houses a statue of Our Lady under the title Magna Mater Austriae, Great Mother of Austria. So it was likely in very close proximity to that statue that he proposed to Princess Zita, then Princess Zita, in front of the Blessed Sacrament. The marriage took place on October 21st, 1911, which, by the way, is his feast day. When Pope John Paul II beatified him, he made the feast day October 21st, not the date of Karl's death, April 1st. And I think this is a deliberate statement, a sort of pro-family, pro-marriage statement to show how important that sacrament was. And how important was that sacrament to Karl? Well, on the eve of their marriage, he said to Zita, "Now we must help each other get to heaven." Karl and Zita's family and devotion to God were their first priorities. During these years, they tried to live a simple, quiet life while Karl continued his military career. In the home, there were always daily family devotions, the rosary, novenas, scripture reading, family catechism, daily mass, and particular pious practices promoted by the Habsburgs, such as devotion to the Blessed Sacrament, to the Holy Cross, to the Immaculate Conception, and to the Feast of Corpus Christi. On June 28, 1914, word came from Sarajevo that the heir apparent, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, had been assassinated, making Karl the new heir apparent. As a consequence of the assassination, war broke out and quickly engulfed all of Europe. Karl is called to lead various military actions and comports himself with valor and honor, leading victorious campaigns on the southern and eastern fronts of the war. In Italy, he commanded his officers to avoid needless bloodshed and, I quote here, quote, "to ensure that the wounded are taken care of as quickly as possible and that the troops are always provided for as well as possible. I forbid the order to take no prisoners. I forbid most emphatically stealing and plundering and wanton destruction. Every soldier in the 20th Corps must be filled with the conviction that we are bearers of culture, even in the land of traitors." Italy, by the way, had switched sides, so he's calling them traitors. So we are the bearers of culture, even in the land of traitors. Emperor Karl, Blessed Emperor Karl, obviously had a very exalted sense of Catholic just war doctrine, an exalted and committed adherence to it, such as we discussed in our last show when we were talking about the Crusades and just war doctrine. In November of 1916, right in the middle of the war, he was called to the deathbed of his great-uncle, Emperor Franz Joseph, who died on the 21st of that month, leaving Karl as his successor. Imagine being such a young man and being called Your Majesty for the first time at the deathbed of your great-uncle. As emperor, Karl set the peace and security of his empire as his first task. He wanted to bring about a speedy end to the war, and he therefore entered into secret peace negotiations through two brothers-in-law, the princes Sixtus and Xavier of Bourbon-Parma. This would be Zita's brothers, who served in the Belgian military. So they were on the other side, okay, family on the other side. This effort at peace and another initiative that Karl made later both failed. That later effort, by the way, was his attempt to second Pope Benedict XV's attempt to make peace between the belligerent powers. Blessed Karl's selflessness and his desire for peace was not seconded by the leaders of the other belligerent parties, neither among the Central Powers nor among the Entente Powers, the Allies. The dogs of war would not heal. A coterie of Freemasons, socialists, communists, and such like wanted to remap Europe into their own image, and they put an end to the last Catholic world power. The empire, they thought, must die. We all know that Blessed Karl was on the losing side of the war. And after the loss, this is where things get really ugly for him. He refused to abdicate the throne, considering that this was something that he had given to him as a trust and as a sacred duty from God. He was therefore exiled to Switzerland. And after an unsuccessful attempt to recover the throne of Hungary, keep in mind, under separate formalities, he's the emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he is the king, the apostolic king, a title going all the way back to St. Stephen of Hungary. And therefore he wore the famous crown of St. Stephen, and you can find a picture of him in an article on the Catholicism.org website that we've linked to from reconquest.net. So he's exiled to Switzerland. He tries to regain his throne in Hungary. He has loyalists in Hungary who bring him in, but the traitorous and oath-breaking and otherwise contemptible Admiral Horthy, who was supposed to be ruling in his place and who had taken an oath that he would help to restore the king, he handed him over. Admiral Horthy handed Blessed Karl over to the Entente Powers, and he was therefore exiled again, not to Switzerland now this time, but to the cold, damp island of Madeira, a Portuguese holding off the coast of Africa. It was known that Karl had weak lungs and was prone to pneumonia, so this was something of a cynically clever death sentence. The plan worked. Karl contracted pneumonia. On his deathbed, he forgave all of his enemies, especially the Masons among them. He declared in an emphatic voice, "I have to suffer so much in order that my people may be united again." Then, kissing a crucifix, he began to pray in what sounded like a dialogue. "Thy holy will be done. Jesus, Jesus, come. Yes, yes, my Jesus, as thou willest it." Conscious to the very end, the emperor gave up the ghost, exhaling with his last breath, "Jesus." This is Brother Andre Marie. The show is Reconquest. You're listening to the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. And continuing with the story of Blessed Karl von Habsburg, I should mention one other thing about his death. It's a very moving death. He died with the holy name of Jesus on his lips. But one of the last things that happened before he died, when he knew he was going to die, was he brought in his oldest son, Otto, who was the heir apparent, who would have succeeded him if the throne had remained. And he said, I want my son to see how an emperor dies. Now, I don't have the exact quote in front of me. I neglected to put it in my notes. But he wanted his son to see how an emperor comports himself under such circumstances. And he gave his son Otto a very, very good example. Otto, by the way, only died a few years ago. He was in his 90s. And he was a man who lived for the service of the church and what remained of Christian Europe to the very end. Now, there's a few lessons that we can derive out of the life of Emperor Karl, and I realize I just gave a pole vault jump version over his life, but I'm going to borrow heavily. I borrowed heavily, by the way, from Brother Nathan Cochrane, OSB, a Benedictine brother who promoted the cause of Blessed Karl, and I'm going to borrow very heavily now from Gary Potter, whose article on this subject is linked from reconquest.net. Gary draws out 5 lessons from Emperor Karl's life that I think we need to consider. And I'm going to read you exactly as he wrote it. So yes, I'm sort of plagiarizing here. First, he was a champion of peace and reconciliation. His statesmanship in seeking an honorable peace to end World War I provides a model for political leaders today who do not scruple to wage war even in anticipatory self-defense. His deathbed forgiveness of his enemies, including the Masons, challenges the many forms of hatred that abound today. His example is instructive to the public as well as to leaders. Second, he was a champion of social justice. Now, to those of you who think that's a bad word, there's a good use of that phrase, social justice. It does not imply socialism, communism, Marxism, or liberalism. Influenced by Pope Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum, Great Social Justice encyclical, he established a ministry of social welfare to implement the Church's social doctrine. His personal commitment to social justice is shown in his use of his carriages and coaches to transport coal to the poor during the war. His implementation of papal social encyclicals sets an example for public officials looking to solve today's economic and social problems. And Gary points out, by the way, that what elected officials today are going to use their limos to bring coal or fuel or food to the needy, hungry. Yet this supposedly spoiled, privileged man who didn't care, let them eat cake. That's how we Americans often think of the royalty. This man used the royal carriage to deliver coal to the poor during the war so they wouldn't suffer. Third, he was a champion of Austro-Slavonic unity and minority ethnic rights. This is very important. Foreseeing Russian dominion over the smaller Slavonic and other ethnic nations sandwiched between Russia and the Prussian empires, Karl strove to transform his own centralized empire into a confederation of individual ethnic nations, each having internal autonomy, but with their security and other benefits provided by a united defense, a common market, economic and financial union, and foreign policy. Had he succeeded, both Hitler and Stalin would have been blocked. What he tried to do still makes geopolitical and economic good sense. Here, Venerable Karl sets an example for ethnic reconciliation and unity among Eastern European peoples still trying to adjust themselves to the circumstances that arose with the fall of the Iron Curtain. By the way, this is a prime example of what we would have spoken of when we interviewed Dr. Wilhelmsen on fueros, the concept of local rights, local rule. In other words, in this large empire, he would have turned the empire into something of a confederation where those ethnic groups, which tended to have internal strife with each other, would have a lot of local autonomy, a lot of local rule. They'd have their own local customs. It wouldn't be one gigantic homogenized amalgamation of a nation. There'd be a lot of localism under such a thing, including local rule, but all of it under the empire with all these common protections and advantages that come from the union that they would have had in the empire. Fourth, he was a champion of Christian family life. The fact that as head of state of a nation at war, he found time for daily mass, family devotions, and catechism classes, gives the lie to our modern excuse of lack of time to pay due attention to our religious obligations. The life of the family he headed stands in contrast to the spirit of a society dominated by liberal materialism and where mortal sin is a normal and socially accepted way of life. The emphasis he placed on Christian formation of his children and the role of the family as the school or domestic church in which this formation should take place makes him an example to modern families struggling against the allures of alternative lifestyles. His deathbed prayer for the perseverance of his children from mortal sin gives pause for reflection in a society where contraception, abortion, sexual freedom, and uninhibited sodomy are considered human rights. We need the example of Venerable Emperor. Gary wrote this, by the way, when Karl was yet a venerable. Blessed Emperor Karl's family, Christian life in an era when highly organized forces, feminism, the homosexualist movement, secular humanism, etc., are crusading to destroy the family as an institution. Finally, the emperor was a champion of the preborn. The thought of his laying his hand on Zita's womb to pray for their unborn daughter, this would be Archduchess Elizabeth, who was their last child, who was in utero during this time. The fact that he did that challenges contemporary society, where the human sacrifice of abortion on the altar of liberal democracy is defended as a right. Further, although the first 5 of his 8 children were born while he possessed his civil list, that is, the salary that he's got as emperor, the last 3 came into the world after he had been dethroned and left penniless. By the way, they didn't have enough money for heat in the summer home that they lived in. They had to borrow somebody's summer home. I believe it was a physician's summer home in Madeira, in the island of Madeira, and it was cold, wet, damp, etc., and had mold on the walls when they went in there. Because of this, he was driven to his death. He contracted pneumonia. This sets an especially instructive example for the many modern couples who deliberately limit the number of their children or have none at all, choosing instead an affluent lifestyle over having a family. So when Emperor Karl was put in a position where he was poor, they still continued to have children. They still continued to be generous with God, and they didn't contracept or do anything that was going to minimize the size of their family because of their difficult circumstances. This is Brother Andre Marie. You're listening to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. When we come back after the break, I'm going to be interviewing via Skype my guest, Mr. Charles Coulombe. Please stick around.
You're listening to Reconquest with Brother Andre Marie, seeking that which was lost and fighting for it. Exclusively on the Veritas Radio Network's Crusade.
Welcome back to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. I'm Brother Andre Marie, coming to you from St. Benedict Center in Richmond, New Hampshire. Our websites are Catholicism.org and Reconquest.net. My email address is bam, B-A-M, at Catholicism.org. I'd like to hear if you have any comments, suggestions, questions. You can find me on Twitter at Brother_Andre, and I'm easily found on Facebook. Tonight we're talking about Blessed Karl von Habsburg, statesman and victim. Joining me now to continue discussing Blessed Karl via Skype is our friend, Mr. Charles Coulombe, the historian, author, literary man, and papal polymath. Good evening, Charles.
Hello.
Charles, I'm talking about Blessed Karl von Habsburg, and I realized as I was doing my preparation, after I'd asked you if you were willing to come on with me to talk about him, I realized that you were at his beatification, weren't you?
I sure was.
Can you tell us anything notable about that great event?
Well, yes, it was really an extraordinary experience for a number of reasons. His son, the Archduke Otto, was there. I knew the Archduke somewhat. He and I had corresponded since I was in high school, and it was wonderful to see him there and his son, the Archduke Karl, named after, of course, his great father. I remember asking him, I said, I'd love to ask you how you're feeling right now, but how can you answer when your father's just been beatified? He said, yes, you're absolutely right. What's to be said? It was an extraordinary event. It was held in 10, and there were other beatifications as well. There was a Brazilian foundress. There was now Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich. They were all beatified at the same time. But I must say that the Emperor Karl supporters turned out in force. And it wasn't just the beatification ceremony itself. There was a audience with Pope John Paul II, now St. John Paul II, in the Nervi audience hall. The Pope, incidentally, was a great devotee of the Emperor Karl because he himself was named after him. Karol Wojtyła was named after Emperor Karl.
Because didn't his father serve in the Imperial Army because Poland was part of, they grew up in the Polish part, or rather in the Austrian part of Poland when Poland was partitioned?
Exactly right. Krakow was one of the major cities of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and one of the titles of the Emperor of Austria was King of Galicia and Lodomeria, which is the easternmost part of Galicia. Now it's in the Ukraine, Lviv and places like that. Anyway, so there was a service of Thanksgiving at St. Mary Major, which, because he was the archpriest of the place at the time, was introduced by Cardinal Law.
with his very broad New England accent.
Well, and that was sort of funny because they had, in the prelude to that ceremony, they had various bishops from around the former empire speaking in different languages I don't understand. And I was sitting there, it was a coolish day, and I was nodding off, frankly, when suddenly my eyes fly open when my ears hear this broad Boston accent. We're very happy to have you here. Oh, boy. One of the great things about being a Catholic is that you can never escape where you come from.
Uh-huh.
But where it doesn't matter where you go, especially if you go to Rome. But anyway, in addition to all that, in addition to the uniformed people who come from all over the former empire and various other places to give honor to the emperor at the beatification, the royals of Europe turned out en masse. I had the opportunity, I ran into, of all people, especially interesting considering history, of running into the current heir to the throne of Italy and a nephew of the current heir to the throne of Serbia, who had come to honor him. I said, when you're with a Savoy and a Karageorgievich to honor a Habsburg, I said, this is a European Union I can really get behind.
Yeah, because of course all these folks tended to fight back in the old days, right?
They sure did, and the Savoys and the Karageorgieviches nevermore. You know, the Karageorgieviches ruling Serbia at the outbreak of the war, and as you mentioned, Italy switching sides. But having said that, they all turned out.
Italy tends to switch sides in wars, don't they? But I guess that's a discussion for another day.
It is. I mean, the Risorgimento and all that really should be discussed. And I wrote a book about the papal element in that, but never mind, I won't make a plug. Seriously, though, it was an extraordinary coming together of many, many different sorts of people, many kinds of people. And again, if you read the sermon, the homily of John Paul II on the occasion, of St. John Paul II, the thing about the Blessed Emperor Karl is that he really is a symbol of unity for everything that's good and decent. And I'm going to say that again. He's a symbol of unity of everything that's good and decent. He brought together in one man, in himself, all the best of Europe. It's ironic in a way that the last king of France prior to the revolution, Louis XVI, was a Bourbon who was married to an Austrian Habsburg, Marie Antoinette. Well, interestingly enough, the Emperor Karl was married to a Bourbon. So the last Habsburg was married to a Bourbon, as the last of those Bourbon was married to a Habsburg. The two great Catholic houses of Europe, whose unfortunate enmity over 2 centuries, frankly, played a terrible role in putting Europe and the world where they are today. But
Empress Zita was a Bourbon Parma. She was from was the House of Parma a subset of the House of Bourbon, or how does that work? You're good with the royal houses.
It's a little complex, so I'll try to make it as plain as possible. In a nutshell, if I can do this, the House of Bourbon were, of course, the rulership of France. Now, in 1700, the King of Spain was dying, and he didn't have a direct heir. He was a Habsburg, the Spanish Habsburgs, of whom Philip II was the first. You may remember the Emperor Charles V, who was the great Habsburg, whose empire went from sea to sea. He was the emperor in Mexico and the Philippines and all over the place. Well, as well as Holy Roman Emperor, he was King of Spain. Well, he had felt that it was too big a crown for any one man to wear. So he left his Austrian possessions of the Holy Roman Empire to his brother, Maximilian, and his Spanish possessions, including the New World, to his son, Philip. And that was the beginning of the separation between the Austrian and Spanish Habsburgs. Well, with Charles I of Spain, Charles II of Spain, that's right, the line of the Austrian Habsburgs was coming to an end. So the question was, who's going to inherit? The Austrian Habsburgs, in the person of the future Emperor Charles VI, thought it should be them. The French felt that it should go to Carlos's grandson, who was, in fact, also the grandson of Louis XIV of France. So that was what began the War of I'm getting confused, the War of Spanish Succession, which we call Queen Anne's War in this country, because it was a world war. It was fought all over the world, including here. When the dust had settled, the grandson, Philip V, as he became, of Louis XIV, became King of Spain and inherited most of the Spanish possessions in the New World and elsewhere. Now, that was the beginning of the House of Bourbon Spain, which is on the throne of Spain today. So there's your first hyphen. Well, Philip's grandson was a fellow called Charles, who originally was not supposed to inherit the throne. He eventually became successively Duke of Parma, and that was the start of the House of Bourbon Parma. And then two Sicilies, which is southern Italy and Sicily.
The Kingdom of the Two Sicilies.
Right, and that was the start of the House of Bourbon Two Sicilies, both of which houses remain today. As it happened, Charles III ended up leaving his brother in the one place and his son, the younger son, in the other, and inherited the throne of Spain. As King of Spain, he was the ancestor of the current heirs, both Carlos and Alfonsino, also founder of Los Angeles, which probably is the greatest thing anyone could have done. This is where I'm supposed to laugh, right? No, you're supposed to agree profoundly. But no, he founded California. He was Father Serra's funder, really. But he was also the man who was the progenitor of the houses of Bourbon Parma and Bourbon Two Sicilies. Now, I won't bore you with all the permutations and the backwards and forwards, but suffice to say that in 1859, the House of Savoy, whose heir I met in the beatification ceremony, the House of Savoy began its conquest of all of Italy. And amongst the people that got thrown out of their positions were the Dukes of Parma, Duke Robert of Parma, who was the father of Empress Zita. He married twice. He was a widower, married again, and had, I think, 8 kids by each. So there were a lot of Bourbon Parmas running around, of whom Zita was one. Interestingly enough, one of them married the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg, and so the Grand Duke of Luxembourg of today is a Bourbon Parma. And interestingly, for part of her time in exile, Zita spent her time looking after her aged relative in Luxembourg.
Interesting. By the way, where I am in southern New Hampshire, Richmond, New Hampshire, I can throw a rock practically into the town of Royalston, Massachusetts, which is due south of us. Empress Zita lived in Royalston, Massachusetts for a time. So,
that's correct.
And it's not named Royalston after her, but it's just kind of an interesting coincidence that Empress Zita actually lived in the town due south of us here. in this obscure wooded area of New England. This is Brother Andre. You're listening to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. I'm interviewing my guest, Mr. Charles Coulombe, and we're talking about Blessed Karl von Habsburg, statesman and victim. So, Charles, what can you tell us? Your audience may know something about the House of Habsburg. You've just given some royal minutiae here. We're talking about a house that goes back, I think the first Habsburg to sit on the imperial throne of the Holy Roman Empire or the German Roman Empire was in the 13th century?
The 1300s, the 14th century. That was the Emperor Rudolph I.
I thought he went back to the previous century.
No, the house does. The family does.
Okay.
They've been around much longer. The first Habsburg in the male line of whom we know was in the 900s, a fellow called Gontran the Rich, probably because he had money. And they were originally from Switzerland, interestingly enough. In fact, Schloss Habsburg, from whence they get their name, is a ruin in Aargau, in the canton of Aargau in Switzerland. But they very soon began to expand through marriage, mostly. And indeed, the House of Habsburg, throughout its history, really was fortunate in its marriages. Hence the old saying, let other nations make war, you, O happy Austria, marry. And that's exactly what happened. Through marriage, they acquired Austria. Then they acquired Bohemia the same way, because what would happen is they ended up marrying a series of heiresses who were basically the last people of their line. Where this became very, very big was when Maximilian the First, the father of Charles V, the grandfather of Charles V, married the heiress to Burgundy, which in those days was the Netherlands, Belgium, and what we call Burgundy today. They inherited that, and then their son, Philip of Burgundy, married the daughter of Isabella and, you remember from school, Queen Isabella and King?
Ferdinand.
Right. So they have Christopher Columbus fame. Isabella, of course, is also up for canonization, so they have more than a few in that family. So their daughter, Joanna the Mad.
Yeah, La Loca, Juana La Loca.
Juana La Loca. She had issues, but she married Philip of Burgundy, who brought all this other stuff with him, and Charles V was their son. So from that time, they never looked back, really. Mm-hmm. And they were an amazing family, because really, of all the houses of Europe, apart from having to fight the Turks constantly, they were probably one of the most peaceful. You could make the argument, of course, that wasn't the case with the conquest of North America and South America, but, you know.
And of course, Emperor Karl epitomizes the placidness of the house in being known as a great peacemaker. Let's shift gears a little bit, Charles, and talk about some bad guys. We talked enough about good guys. Let's talk about some bad guys. Let's talk about President Wilson's role, our own beloved president's role in really the victimization. We're talking about Karl as victim. So let's talk about those who victimized him.
Well, I would have to say that three would stand out, and Wilson would be the worst of the bunch. My little joke about President Wilson is that he was our only president to be an ordained minister of the gospel, as they say, Presbyterian, and the only president we've ever had who was at war with a saint. So that what you will. Also, although a Presbyterian minister, he's entombed in a very impressive tomb in the Episcopal National Cathedral in Washington. So you can go and venerate him if you choose. At any rate, only a stone's throw, by the way, from a shrine to the Blessed Karl at Old St. Mary's.
How ironic! How ironic!
Yeah, it's a strange world we live in. It gets stranger by the day. But anyway, so Wilson was a very obnoxious man. He had been president of Princeton which he considered more of an honor than President of the United States, I suppose. He became President of the United States, and he immediately did several things. First, he imposed the 14 points. Now, I have to say something here, which might be a little bit controversial. But
well,
Wilson was,
we don't shy from controversy here on the Veritas Radio Network, Charles.
Well, that's good, because I'm going to say something that I think is rather controversial. Woodrow Wilson, in common with President Lincoln and President Franklin Roosevelt, was a devotee of something called unconditional surrender. Mm-hmm. I have to say that I cannot think of anything more immoral or that had worse results in history.
Which, of course, set the stage for World War II.
It set the stage for World War II and, of course, was used in World War II. It was unconditional surrender that put off the deposition, I firmly believe, that put off the deposition of Hitler until 44. You know, I don't think there's anyone who is insane who wouldn't admit that if we had told the German officer, the German General Staff, get rid of Hitler and we'll make a decent peace for you. But you tell people, no, unconditional surrender. You give up everything now, throw yourself at your mercy, or fight to the death. Well, you know, given a choice like that, at any rate, so that's my controversial statement. In Wilson's 14 points, he called for the self-determination of peoples. Obviously, he didn't apply that to Latin America, where he'd been busy intervening in Mexico. But we'll leave that alone.
Mm-hmm. Well, self-determination is one of those things that's almost always very selectively applied when you're talking about those who are in the ascendancy, right?
Yeah, it's like freedom of speech. You know, it means freedom of my speech. Everyone has the right to my opinion. Anyway, so the thing was that he called for self-determination for the peoples of Austria-Hungary. But that could mean anything at that point. He then, however, as the war continued, he made it very clear that there would be no peace until they got rid of the Habsburgs. End of story.
So whereas Karl himself wanted some degree of self-determination for the people, as I mentioned earlier, because he wanted to have this ethnic rule, this local autonomy as part of the empire. Of course, we think of highly centralized governments, and we think of monarchies, and when we think of empires and kingdoms, but by and large, they weren't highly centralized governments, were they?
Not really, and certainly, I don't think there is a monarchical government of the past whose head of state had anything like the power that ours does.
Mm-hmm. And of course, I don't think that Woodrow Wilson would have been for self-determination for the people of, say, the Confederate States of America.
No, or the American Indians.
So there's a whole lot of hypocrisy that comes with this. That's what we're trying to say, right?
Not that hypocrisy is a bad thing. I don't want to come out against hypocrisy.
Who are we to judge?
Exactly. But no, seriously, it created a situation where you've got an enemy who is starving, literally, and Austria was starving. There's no doubt about that. You have a country which is deeply divided ethnically, and bear in mind, going back a little bit to Karl's predecessor as heir to the throne, not as emperor, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was famously murdered at Sarajevo. He had been an advocate of the transformation of what was a dual monarchy into a confederation of sorts. And this made him very unpopular among some of the Magyar politicians, I can tell you. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Because the way the thing was run at that point was that in 1867, for various reasons, Franz Joseph, the then Emperor, King of Hungary, Emperor of Austria, had committed to a duality of rule in his territories between Hungary and Austria. The problem was that Hungary was made up of many different nationalities, of whom the Magyars were the dominant. But you had Slovaks, you had Serbs, you had Romanians, you had all these people. When a significant chunk of the Magyars revolted against the dynasty in 1848, the minority peoples had rallied to the dynasty. The Croats, the Ukrainians, all these guys.
The dynasty being the Habsburg dynasty.
The Habsburg dynasty. So the Hungarian Revolution is put down in 1849 with the help of Russia, incidentally. And things go. But then in 1866, Austria is defeated by Prussia and tossed out of Germany. And Franz Joseph feels compelled to make a deal with the Magyars, and he does, the so-called Ausgleich, which created Austria-Hungary.
Okay. Now, we talked a little bit about President Wilson, and I'm sure there's a lot more that you can say about him and his evil role of remapping Europe and creating all kinds of false nations that eventually would fall apart and give us World War II. But there was another bad guy who became the head of state, the usurping head of state of Austria after Blessed Karl was tossed out. Who would that be?
Well, Karl Renner.
Not to be confused with Karl Rahner, who's also a bad guy.
No relation. Yeah, but in a different way. Karl Renner was a socialist. He was the founder of the First Austrian Republic, and he played a part in the Second Austrian Republic as well. He's considered a hero by Austrian socialists and Republicans today. Interestingly enough, they don't like to boast about his wartime record, in which he asked the Nazis if he could collaborate, and they refused.
So he's part of that small club of people who wanted to be a Nazi collaborator and were rejected.
And were rejected by the Nazis for lack of quality. But, why the Austrian socialists aren't proud of this, I don't know, but that's just me. You can contrast this with Karl's son's work during the war, trying to organize resistance, but that's another story as well. Anyway,
meaning Emperor Karl, not Karl Renner.
No, Emperor Karl.
Emperor Karl's sons tried to what? What did he try to do?
Organize resistance against Hitler. In fact, Renner and the socialists were put out of power in the 20s. And then in 1932, a fellow came to power in Austria called Engelbert Dollfuss, who was a pretty neat guy, of whom another story is.
Who was murdered by the Nazis.
He was murdered by the Nazis in 1934, doesn't get a great deal of credit, etc. I mean, basically, historians of today, at least the popular ones, I hesitate to say that they cast a blind eye toward malfeasance on the left and always see it on the right, but they do.
We hate to say it, but it's true.
I hesitate to say it.
Look, Charles, we've got about 3.5 minutes or so. What can you tell me about devotion to Karl in Austria and Central Europe today? I know you go there from time to time.
I do indeed, and the answer is it is huge. It is really, really, really gigantic. For one thing, since the beatification, his relics have gone all over the world. And of course, that means a shrine in so many churches. And not just where you'd expect, in Austria, Hungary, the Czech Republic, but in Belgium and Germany and Italy, Spain and Switzerland. Madeira, of course, where he ended up dying in exile, is a great shrine to him. But we have a number of shrines to him in this country. Several of them are Byzantine, and this makes sense because the Emperor Karl was very much loved by the Ukrainian and Ruthenian Rite Catholics in his territories. He was a great, and let me just say also, I don't know if you touched upon this earlier, he was a great devotee of the Rosary, the Blessed Sacrament, and the Sacred Heart.
I did not mention the Sacred Heart, and I didn't actually talk explicitly about the Pietas Austriaca.
Well, the Pietas Austriaca is the you might say the in-house devotion of the House of Habsburg. They have a very particular style. It's very Marian, very Eucharistic, very devoted to the Sacred Heart, the Passion, Holy Cross, all these sorts of things.
The Holy Cross with the crown of thorns, I believe, is it's not a Habsburg seal, but it's what is it a symbol of? The
symbol of the Gebetsliga, which is an organization we should say something about as well. The Gebetsliga, the League of Prayer for Peace Among Nations, is the organization headquartered in Austria, but branches all over the world, including this country. It spreads devotion to the emperor and is pushing for his canonization, as well to some degree as for his empress, who's a servant of God. Her cause has been introduced. Now, what's interesting about the Gebetsliga, there are a lot of interesting stories about the Emperor Karl, none of which get done in great detail, but I'll tell this one. He was born in 1895, and when he was born, there was an Ursuline nun in Sopron in Hungary who had the stigmata, but she told people that this little Archduke, and bear in mind, Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the throne. His younger brother, the Archduke Otto, who was the father of Karl, was not seen as anything like it. There was no idea that this little infant would one day be emperor.
Mm-hmm.
But this nun predicted that he would be. And she called for the formation of a league of prayer for his well-being, because she said he's going to be emperor, but he'll have tons of troubles, and everyone needs to pray for him. So that was the start of the Gebetsliga. And it's been going since 1895.
So they transformed themselves from praying for, they were founded specifically to pray for Blessed Emperor Karl from the time he was an infant.
Right.
And they continued, and then they were transformed in purpose to work for his canonization, right?
Right, exactly right. First for the introduction of his cause, then his beatification, and now his canonization.
I'm going to put a link to the Gebetsliga website, because there's an English website. I'm going to put it up on the reconquest.net page. There
are a couple. There's emperorcharles.org, which is an ultra-important resource. And then Gebetsliga, that's www.gebetsliga, Gebetsliga.com, which has an English site, as you've rightly put out. Then there's the beatification of the Empress Zita, which you should definitely look at. And that's www.beatification-imperatrice, Imperatrice, Imperatrice, it's French for Empress, Zita, Z-I-T-A, .org.
I'll put if you send me those links, I'll put all those links up on the reconquest.net page.
I'll send all that to you. And then also there's an article in German which you can easily translate using the miracle of Google Translate. It comes out very well on the devotion of the Emperor Karl to the Sacred Heart. And it's a very valuable article.
Well, Charles, look, that's all we have time for. I know that you and I could probably talk for like 6 hours about this. But alas, alack, we have come to the end of our time. Thank you so much for...
May I say one thing? And
yes.
That is, especially in an election year in our country, but in general, the Emperor Karl epitomized all that we should have in rulership and all that we don't have.
Mm.
And in this election year in particular, in a country which... in so many strange ways sort of kind of resembles Austria-Hungary, in its multiplicity, its weird pluralism, and so on, its diversity. Let's all pray to the Emperor Karl for our beloved nation. And actually, if you think about it, because of President Wilson, we have an obligation to make a certain amount of reparation to him.
Yep. Well, that's a good last point. Thank you very much, Charles. And please stick around after the break, and I'll have my final short little segment. You're listening to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network.
Your guide to the reconquest of what modern man has lost. Think of it as a roadmap to truth with a crucifix as a compass. Reconquest is exclusively on the Veritas Radio Network's Crusade.